Greetings! Today we delve into the intriguing world of economics as we dissect Jeremy Hunt's recent autumn statement. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has stirred up quite a storm with his controversial announcement of tax cuts that many argue the country simply cannot afford. Hunt's decision to fund these tax cuts by dipping into funds set aside for public services after the next election has raised eyebrows and stirred up a whirlwind of criticism. Critics argue that this strategy will have a negative impact on those who rely heavily on public infrastructure and could potentially suppress future growth prospects. The tax cuts have been based on a rather illusory impact of inflation on nominal wages. Despite the illusion of higher wages, average living standards are forecasted to decrease. Critics argue that the funds should have been allocated to public spending to cope with the rising costs of inflation. Instead, these funds are being diverted for tax reductions, leading to further spending cuts on public services. The tax burden as a share of the gross domestic product is increasing, and the tax cuts disproportionately benefit the better off. This is a matter of concern as it potentially widens the gap between the rich and the poor, leading to increased economic inequality. Labour faces a challenging road ahead. If they win the next election, they will have to navigate funding additional spending in a state where public services are under strain and potentially hindering economic growth. Critics argue that it's unlikely any government will be able to stick to the spending envelope outlined by Hunt. Without funding for public infrastructure, the country could be staring at a low-growth future. As we have seen, this move by Hunt has sparked a heated debate among economists, and it's clear that the implications of this decision will be felt for years to come. Now let's take a closer look at these tax cuts. What do they entail, and who stands to benefit the most? The Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has announced tax cuts that he insists the country can afford, but a closer examination reveals a different picture. Let's delve into the specifics. The tax cuts are based on the illusionary impact of inflation on nominal wages. Despite higher wages, average living standards are forecasted to decrease. The tax burden as a share of the country's GDP is actually increasing, not decreasing. This is because the tax cuts are being funded by raiding money that has been reserved for public services after the next election. This approach will negatively impact those who rely on public infrastructure, suppress future growth prospects, and perpetuate the belief that cutting public spending is economically beneficial. The tax cuts also disproportionately benefit the better off. This is a common feature of tax cuts, as they often provide more relief to those in higher income brackets. The tax cuts are being implemented within current fiscal rules over a 5-year period, ensuring that national debt decreases relative to output. However, this approach neglects the immediate needs of those who rely on public services. This is where the problem lies. The money that could have been allocated to public spending to cope with the rising costs of inflation is instead being used for tax reductions. This leads to further spending cuts on public services and places a heavier burden on those who rely on them the most. It's also worth noting that these tax cuts could pose challenges for future governments. For instance, if Labour were to win the next election, they would face difficulties in funding additional spending due to the state of public services, which could hinder economic growth. So while the idea of tax cuts may seem appealing on the surface, the reality is that they could lead to a low-growth future for the country. They may also exacerbate income inequality by disproportionately benefiting those who are better off. It's evident that these tax cuts may not be as beneficial as they initially seem, especially for those who rely heavily on public services. So what does the future hold in the wake of these tax cuts? In the grand scheme of things, these tax cuts could potentially suppress future growth prospects, setting the stage for a low-growth future. As the country navigates the ripple effects of these changes, it's crucial to consider the long-term impact. The tax cuts, while initially appearing beneficial, have a hidden cost. By diverting funds from public services to tax reductions, we're inadvertently stifling our growth potential. These public services form the backbone of our economy, propelling innovation and providing essential services that contribute to a prosperous society. Moreover, these tax cuts disproportionately benefit the better off, widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. This growing divide could lead to social instability, further hampering our growth prospects. And let's not forget about the potential challenges that Labour might face if they win the next election. With public services already under strain, any plans for additional spending could be hindered by the state of the economy. This could result in a catch-22 scenario, where the need for investment in public services is high, yet the resources to do so are scarce. What's clear is that these tax cuts, while offering immediate relief, may come at a high cost in the long run. The question remains, can we afford to pay this price? Only time will tell how these tax cuts will truly impact the economy and the lives of everyday citizens. Economics is not just for economists. It's a conversation we all need to participate in. We live in a society where the decisions made by those in power have a direct impact on our daily lives. From the taxes we pay to the public services we rely on, we're all part of this intricate economic web. That's why it's essential to stay informed about economic issues, to question, to critique, and to voice your opinions. You see, we're not just passive participants in this economy, we're active contributors, and our voices can shape the decisions that determine our economic futures. Remember, your voice matters in these discussions, so stay informed, stay engaged, and let's ensure that our economy works for all of us. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions. Until next time, stay savvy.